I used to believe that becoming an adult meant mastering the art of not feeling too much. I admired people who seemed impossible to shake, the ones who never looked jealous, never lost their temper, never worried out loud, never admitted that someone else's success bothered them. I thought emotional control meant deleting emotions altogether. So whenever envy crept into my mind, or anxiety settled in my chest, I treated them like stains that had to be scrubbed away before anyone noticed. If I caught myself comparing my life to someone else's, I would silently scold myself. If I became irritated over a careless remark, I would repeat that I was overreacting. If I lay awake imagining everything that could go wrong tomorrow, I would force myself to think positive thoughts until exhaustion finally won. For a while, it looked like I was doing well. People described me as calm and easygoing. They had no idea that inside I was constantly sweeping uncomfortable feelings under an imaginary rug, hoping they would disappear on their own. The first crack in that strategy appeared during an ordinary dinner with a close friend. They casually mentioned receiving an opportunity that I had quietly wanted for years. I smiled, congratulated them, asked polite questions, and even offered to celebrate. But when I walked home that night, my stomach tightened with something I refused to name. I told myself I was being petty. I reminded myself that good things happening to other people did not take anything away from me. The lecture in my head continued until I reached my apartment, where I dropped my keys twice because my hands were trembling. Instead of feeling better, I felt guilty for feeling jealous, and then guilty for feeling guilty. A few days later, another friend noticed I seemed distracted and asked what was wrong. Nothing, I answered automatically. They looked at me for a moment before saying, "You know, emotions are information before they become behavior." I laughed, because it sounded like something from a psychology book, but the sentence stayed with me. Information, not instructions. I had never considered that possibility. Around that time I started keeping a notebook, mostly because I was tired of having arguments with myself that never ended. Whenever I felt a strong emotion, I wrote down what had happened immediately before it. At first, the entries were embarrassingly simple. Saw someone else succeed. Received criticism. Didn't get a reply. Couldn't sleep. But after several weeks, I noticed patterns I had completely missed while living through them. The jealousy I hated so much almost always appeared when someone achieved something I secretly wanted, but had stopped admitting even to myself. The anger that seemed to explode out of nowhere usually arrived after I felt dismissed or ignored, even in small conversations. My anxiety spiked before situations where I believed one mistake would permanently define me. Then, something unexpected happened. During a conversation with an older relative, I mentioned the notebook, almost as a joke, and they told me about a concept they had learned years ago from a therapist. Emotions often last far longer when we try to suppress them than when we acknowledge them. Curious, I looked into it and discovered research suggesting that deliberately pushing thoughts and feelings away can actually make them rebound more strongly, a phenomenon sometimes called the ironic process effect. I remember staring at the screen thinking, I have been accidentally feeding the very things I wanted to eliminate. That changed the way I saw my own mind. I experimented with a different approach. Instead of saying, I shouldn't feel jealous, I would write, I notice I feel jealous because this matters to me. Instead of saying, stop worrying, I would write, I'm worried because I'm trying to protect something important. The emotions did not instantly vanish, but they stopped multiplying. One afternoon, the experiment was tested in a way I could not avoid. I spent weeks preparing for a presentation that I believed could change the direction of my career. When the feedback finally arrived, most of it focused on flaws I had overlooked. I felt heat rush into my face and heard myself responding defensively. The conversation became awkward, and afterward I replayed every sentence while walking outside under a sky that threatened rain. By the time I reached a nearby bench, I was furious, not just at the criticism, but at the person who had delivered it. My first instinct was to compose a long message explaining why they were wrong. Instead, almost mechanically, I opened my notebook. I wrote down every accusation that was bouncing around my head, then added one question underneath: what boundary or value feels threatened? The answer surprised me. It wasn't excellence. It wasn't fairness. I was terrified that being criticized meant I was inadequate. Once I recognized that fear, the anger softened enough for me to reread the comments more honestly. Some were unfair. Several were completely accurate. I rewrote the presentation, and although it still wasn't perfect, it improved in ways I would never have accepted if I had sent the defensive message that afternoon. Not every lesson arrived through success. A misunderstanding with someone close to me nearly ended a relationship I cared deeply about. They canceled plans several times in a row, always with reasonable explanations, but resentment quietly accumulated inside me, until I convinced myself they no longer valued our friendship. Rather than asking directly, I became distant. They noticed, asked if something was wrong, and I insisted everything was fine. Eventually they confronted me with visible frustration. "You're upset, but you keep pretending you're not. I can't solve a problem I'm not allowed to see." Hearing that hurt, because it was true. During that conversation, we traced the situation backward and realized my irritation had masked disappointment. And the disappointment had masked fear that I was becoming unimportant to someone whose opinion mattered to me. We talked for hours, corrected assumptions on both sides, and walked away relieved, more than triumphant. If I had continued insisting that I wasn't supposed to feel hurt, I probably would have lost that friendship without ever understanding why. Months later, I attended a workshop where participants practiced identifying emotions with more precise vocabulary than simply happy, sad, angry, or stressed. The facilitator explained that studies suggest people who can distinguish among similar emotions in finer detail often regulate them more effectively, because the brain responds differently when vague distress becomes accurately labeled. During one exercise, I realized I was not anxious about an upcoming decision at all. I was uncertain and impatient. Those are different problems with different solutions. That tiny distinction felt oddly liberating. I began catching myself saying, "I'm embarrassed," instead of "I'm angry," or "I'm disappointed," instead of "I'm frustrated." The labels did not magically fix my life, but they made it harder to blame the wrong cause. Looking back through the notebook after nearly a year, I noticed another pattern. The entries I once considered evidence of failure had become a map of my priorities. The pages full of worry were about people I deeply loved. The pages full of jealousy pointed toward ambitions I had buried, because they seemed unrealistic. The pages describing anger often involved moments when I believed someone's dignity, including my own, had been ignored. Even my recurring fear about the future reflected a desire for stability rather than greed. None of those discoveries excused harmful behavior. Feeling angry still did not justify saying cruel things. Feeling jealous still did not entitle me to resent someone else's happiness. But separating the emotion from the action gave me room to choose differently. I think about one evening in particular when everything came together. I was sitting alone after receiving news that someone else had reached a milestone I once imagined for myself. The familiar sting arrived almost immediately. For a second I prepared to lecture myself again, to insist that decent people should never feel this way. Instead I made tea, opened the old notebook with its worn edges, and quietly wrote, "This hurts, because I wanted it too." Nothing dramatic happened. The room stayed silent except for the sound of rain against the window. The feeling lingered for a while, then slowly changed into curiosity. If this mattered enough to awaken envy, perhaps it deserved another attempt instead of another burial. I closed the notebook, looked around the apartment, and noticed how different that moment felt from the nights when I had tried so desperately to erase every uncomfortable emotion before it could exist. The emotions themselves had never been the loudest source of suffering. The exhausting part had been fighting them while refusing to ask why they had arrived in the first place. And once I finally stopped treating every unwelcome feeling like an enemy at the door, I found that many of them had been carrying messages I was only ready to read after they had already knocked for a very long time.